It was just another Tuesday afternoon at the Ellen DeGeneres Show, the studio buzzing with its usual electric energy. The familiar blue and white lights painted the stage in warm hues, while the opening music pulsed through speakers, getting the audience ready for what they expected to be another hour of laughter, dancing, and Ellen's infectious joy. But sometimes, in the most ordinary moments, something extraordinary happens that changes everything. Margaret Thompson sat in the third row, seat 14, her hands folded neatly in her lap. At 88, she had silver hair pulled back in a modest bun and wore a lavender cardigan that had seen many seasons. While 300 other audience members clapped, laughed, and cheered around her, Margaret remained perfectly still. Not a smile, not a clap, not even the slightest acknowledgement that she was part of this celebration of life happening all around her. Ellen bounded onto the stage with her signature energy, wearing a crisp white button-down and navy blazer, her short blonde hair catching the studio lights. "Hello, hello, hello," she called out, her arms spread wide as the audience erupted in cheers. The familiar ritual began, the dancing, the jokes, the warm-up that made everyone feel like they were part of something special. But as Ellen moved through her opening monologue, making jokes about celebrity mishaps and everyday absurdities, her eyes kept drifting to row 3. There, amidst a sea of animated faces, sat this one woman who seemed to exist in a completely different world. While her neighbors laughed at Ellen's punchlines, Margaret stared straight ahead with an expression that wasn't angry or disinterested. It was something deeper, something that made Ellen's comedian instincts pause. The show continued as planned. Ellen brought out her first guest, a young actor promoting his new romantic comedy. They talked, they laughed, they played a silly game that had the audience in stitches, but Ellen found herself glancing back at Margaret throughout the segment. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't even blinked more than necessary. During the commercial break, Ellen walked to the edge of the stage. She often used these moments to connect with the audience, to share a quick joke or thank someone for coming. But this time, she found herself looking directly at Margaret. "How are you doing today?" Ellen called out to the general audience, and the response was the usual chorus of enthusiasm. But Margaret simply looked up at Ellen, with eyes that held something Ellen couldn't quite identify. Not sadness, exactly, not anger, something more profound. When they came back from commercial, Ellen introduced her next segment, a surprise reunion between a military father and his young daughter, who thought he was still overseas. It was the kind of heartwarming moment that typically brought the entire studio to tears of joy. Cameras captured audience members wiping their eyes, hands over hearts, the collective emotional release that made television magic. But Margaret didn't cry. She didn't smile. She didn't react at all. That's when Ellen made a decision that would change everything. "Hold on," Ellen said suddenly, stopping mid-sentence during her transition to the next segment. The production team in the booth exchanged confused glances. "This wasn't in the script. Hold on, just a minute." Ellen set down her microphone on the coffee table and walked to the edge of the stage. The studio fell quiet, sensing that something unplanned was happening. "Ma'am," Ellen said, looking directly at Margaret. "In the third row, in the lavender sweater. What's your name?" 300 people turned to look at Margaret, who seemed startled to suddenly be the center of attention. She looked around, as if checking to make sure Ellen was really talking to her. "Me?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "Yes, you. What's your name, sweetheart?" "Margaret," she replied, her voice carrying just far enough for the closest microphones to pick up. Ellen nodded and did something she had never done in over a decade of hosting. She walked down the stage steps and into the audience. Cameras scrambled to follow her, but Ellen wasn't thinking about cameras anymore. She was thinking about this woman who seemed to be carrying something too heavy for anyone to bear alone. Ellen reached Margaret's row and gently asked the people beside her to move down, creating space for her to sit next to this stranger who had somehow called out to her without saying a word. "Margaret," Ellen said softly, settling into the seat beside her. "I have to ask, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but are you okay?" The studio was completely silent now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something real, something unscripted, something that happens when one human being recognizes pain in another and chooses to respond. Margaret looked at Ellen, really looked at her, for the first time since the show began. And in that moment, Ellen saw what she had been sensing from the stage. This wasn't a woman who didn't want to be here. This was a woman who was here because someone she loved had wanted her to be. "My daughter," Margaret said quietly, and those two words carried the weight of everything Ellen needed to understand. Ellen didn't rush her, didn't push for more details, just sat there in the middle of her own television show, holding space for whatever Margaret needed to say. "She died last month," Margaret continued, her voice steady but fragile. "Cancer. She was 46. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She bought these tickets 6 months ago, said she was going to take me to see Ellen DeGeneres for my birthday because I needed more laughter in my life." The paper was a printout of their confirmation email, worn from being folded and unfolded many times. Ellen could see where tears had left small water stains on the paper. She said, Margaret's voice wavered slightly. She said you were the funniest person in the world, and that watching your show was better than any medicine. She made me promise that even if something happened to her, I would still come, that I would laugh for both of us. Ellen felt her own eyes filling with tears. Around them, the studio audience was completely silent. But Ellen wasn't thinking about them anymore. She was thinking about a daughter who loved her mother enough to buy tickets to a show 6 months in advance. About a woman who kept a promise to someone who would never know if she kept it or not. "But I can't," Margaret whispered. "I've been sitting here for an hour, trying to laugh, trying to feel what she wanted me to feel, and I just can't. I thought maybe if I came, if I sat in this seat she picked out for me, I could feel her with me. But I just feel empty." Ellen reached over and took Margaret's hand. It was small and cold, the hand of someone who had been holding on too tightly for too long. "Margaret," Ellen said, and her voice carried a gentleness that 300 people had never heard from her before. "What was your daughter's name?" "Susan," Margaret replied. "Susan Marie. She was a teacher, 3rd grade. She said kids were the best audience because they laughed at everything." Ellen smiled through her tears. "Susan Marie sounds like she was an amazing person." She was. She really was. Ellen looked around the studio, at all the cameras and lights and people, and made another unprecedented decision. "You know what, Margaret? Susan was wrong about one thing." Margaret looked up at her with confusion. "You don't need to laugh for both of you," Ellen said. "You just need to be here. That's enough. That's more than enough. Susan didn't buy these tickets because she wanted you to perform happiness. She bought them because she wanted you to know that even when she couldn't be with you anymore, there would still be places where love exists, where people care about each other, where you're not alone." Margaret's composure finally broke. The tears came quietly at first, then deeper, the kind of crying that comes from a place beyond words. Ellen didn't try to stop her, or comfort her, or make it better. She just sat there, holding the hand of a grieving mother in the middle of her own television show. After a few minutes, Margaret's breathing steadied. She looked at Ellen with eyes that seemed lighter somehow. "I miss her so much," Margaret said. "Of course you do," Ellen replied. "That's what love looks like when someone's not here anymore. It doesn't go away. It just changes shape. Ellen stood up and addressed her production team. "We're going to take a longer break," she announced. "And when we come back, we're going to do something different." 20 minutes later, when the cameras started rolling again, Ellen was back on stage. But she wasn't alone. Margaret sat in the guest chair, still wearing her lavender cardigan, looking nervous but no longer empty. "I want you all to meet my friend Margaret," Ellen said to the camera. "She's here today because her daughter Susan loved this show. Susan died last month, but she made Margaret promise to come anyway, to laugh for both of them." Ellen turned to Margaret. "But here's the thing we learned today. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. Love doesn't follow a script. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is just show up, even when you can't laugh yet, even when you can't feel joy yet, even when all you can do is breathe." Ellen reached under her desk and pulled out a small wrapped box. "Margaret, this isn't going to fix anything. It's not going to bring Susan back or make the pain go away. But Susan wanted you to know that you're loved, and I want you to know that too." Margaret opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a simple silver necklace with a small charm, a heart with the word always engraved on it. "That's from Susan," Ellen said, "and it's from all of us who believe that love really is always present, always continuing, always finding new ways to show up." Margaret put the necklace on with Ellen's help. "I can feel her now," she whispered. "I can feel her here." "She is here," Ellen said, "in your courage to keep her promise, in your willingness to let us see your pain, in the love that's so strong it brought you to a place where you thought you couldn't be." The audience, which had been silent throughout this entire exchange, began to applaud. Not the enthusiastic television applause they'd started with, but something deeper, the kind of recognition that happens when people witness something real, something true, something that reminds them of their own capacity for love and loss and courage. Ellen looked directly into the main camera. "Sometimes this show is about laughter, and that's important. But today, it's about something else. It's about showing up for each other. It's about keeping promises, even when they break our hearts. It's about understanding that grief and joy can sit in the same room. That love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to express itself." She turned back to Margaret. "Susan was right about one thing, though. This is a place where people care about each other, and you, Margaret Thompson, are proof of that. You're proof that love keeps its promises." After the show wrapped, Ellen spent another hour with Margaret backstage. They talked about Susan, about teaching, about the way grief comes in waves, and how that's not something to fix, but something to honor. Ellen gave Margaret her personal phone number and made her promise to call anytime she needed to remember that she wasn't alone. 6 months later, Ellen received a letter. It was from Margaret, written in careful handwriting on flowered sagedry. It said, "Dear Ellen, I wanted you to know that I'm laughing again. Not all the time, and not the same way I used to, but I'm laughing. And when I do, I think of Susan, I think of you, and I think of that day when you stopped your whole show to sit with a broken-hearted mother. You were right. Love really is always. It just changes shape. Thank you for helping me find mine again. With love and gratitude, Margaret and Susan." Ellen framed that letter and hung it in her dressing room, where she could see it every day before going on stage, because it reminded her of something crucial, that sometimes the most important thing you can do isn't make people laugh. Sometimes it's helping them remember that their tears matter too, that their grief is sacred, and that showing up is always enough. The episode with Margaret became one of the most talked about in the show's history. Not because of any celebrity guest or elaborate surprise, but because it captured something rare, a moment when entertainment became ministry, when a talk show host became a healer, and when a grieving mother taught an entire studio audience what courage really looks like. Margaret kept Susan's promise that day. But more than that, she set something else alive. The belief that love transcends death, that promises matter even when they hurt, and that sometimes the most profound healing happens when we stop trying to fix each other and start learning to simply witness each other's pain with compassion. And Ellen learned something too, that the laughter she'd built her career on was important, but the silence she shared with Margaret that day was sacred, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do on television is nothing at all. Just sit beside someone who hurts and let them know they're not alone. 3 years later, Ellen received another letter. This time, it was from a teacher in Wisconsin named Jennifer, who had watched the Margaret episode during her own battle with depression. She wrote that seeing Ellen stop everything to sit with someone in pain had given her permission to ask for help. Another letter came from a father in Texas who had lost his son and felt seen for the first time after watching Margaret's story. The episode had become something bigger than television. It became proof that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the birthplace of connection. That grief shared is grief. That sometimes the most radical thing you can do in a world obsessed with performance is to simply stop and acknowledge someone's humanity. Ellen began ending each show differently after that day. Instead of just be kind to one another, she would add, and remember, showing up is enough. You are enough, exactly as you are. Right now, in this moment, you are enough. Margaret never missed another episode. She watched from her small apartment in Ohio, wearing Susan's favorite sweater and the silver necklace Ellen had given her. And slowly, gradually, she began to smile again. Not the same smile she'd had before. That version of herself lived in a different world, one where Susan was still answering her phone calls, but a new smile, one that carried both sorrow and hope, one that understood that joy and grief could coexist in the same heart. On the anniversary of Susan's death, Margaret returned to the studio, not as an audience member this time, but as Ellen's special guest. She brought a photo of Susan, a radiant woman with kind eyes, and her mother's gentle smile. They talked about how grief changes but never leaves, how love finds new expressions, and how that first day had taught them both that healing doesn't mean forgetting. Susan would be so proud, Ellen said, looking at the photo. She is proud, Margaret corrected softly. She's always proud. Because that's what love looks like in action. That's what healing sounds like when it's real. And that's what happens when one human being chooses to see another's pain and respond not with entertainment, but with presence, pure, unscripted, transformative presence that reminds us all that we're never truly alone.